It began quietly, the way most wars do, not with fire, not with shouting, but with a letter slipped into my mailbox one cool spring morning. The HOA of Maplewood Estates had decided that my little house on the corner, the one with the cedar porch, swing, and the wildflower garden, would no longer be allowed to exist outside their control. The envelope bore their emblem, a cheap gold seal pressed onto heavy paper, and inside it was a demand. I was to join their association, pay their fees, and submit to their rules, effective immediately. I had lived in Maplewood for years without a single problem. My property sat on land that predated the HOA itself. When they incorporated, their reach fell short of my deed, and I never signed away my rights. But that didn't stop them from trying. For years, they sent friendly reminders, thinly veiled threats tucked between glossy newsletters about block parties and landscaping contests. I ignored them all, knowing that legally, they had no power over me. But this letter was different. It was a declaration of war. The language was sharper, less polite. Failure to comply would result in escalating consequences. They called my garden unsightly, my house non-conforming, and my refusal a danger to community standards. It was absurd, laughable even, but beneath the polished words was something darker. They wanted control, and I had become the last holdout standing in their way. My house wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. Built in the late 60s, it still carried the charm of old wood and stubborn craftsmanship. The cedar swing on the porch creaked on summer evenings as I read books or listened to cicadas. The wildflowers that spilled out along the fence weren't carefully planned by landscapers. They grew where they pleased, attracting bees, butterflies, and the occasional hummingbird. To me, it was a little patch of freedom. To the HOA, it was chaos, an eyesore that offended their endless quest for uniformity. They wanted manicured lawns, beige paint colors, and cookie-cutter conformity. My little house broke their illusion of control. Most people in my neighborhood complied with the HOA because they didn't know any better. They signed checks without reading bylaws, followed orders without questioning their legality. But I was not most people. Before retiring, I had spent 2 decades as a municipal attorney. I had written the very ordinances the HOA was attempting to twist. I knew where the lines of power ended, and I knew they were bluffing. At first, I thought about throwing the letter away, treating it like the dozens that had come before. But something in the tone told me this time would be different. Their patience had snapped. They weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. The following week, I began to notice little things. A pair of HOA board members parked across from my house longer than usual, scribbling notes on clipboards as though documenting every crack in my driveway. The president herself, a woman named Linda with the permanent scowl of someone allergic, to joy, slowed her walks whenever she passed my property, staring hard at the garden I loved so much. Then came the anonymous complaints filed with the county inspector, all unfounded, all dismissed. It was harassment, plain and simple, but it didn't rattle me. I had fought bigger bullies before. Still, I started documenting everything. Every letter, every car idling outside my house, every petty act of intimidation. Old instincts kicked in. The lawyer in me assembling evidence, anticipating the moment when I might need it. I even kept copies of county records, my deed, and photographs of my property carefully organized in a binder. If they thought they could wear me down, they didn't realize I was already preparing for battle. Then came the subtle escalations. Someone dumped trash in my yard one night. Another time, the bolts on my mailbox were loosened, leaving it dangling by a thread. My garden fence was cut in 2 places. None of these acts were violent enough to prove, but all were clear messages. They wanted me gone. What I didn't know then was how far they were willing to go. The HOA had grown drunk on its own authority, mistaking compliance for loyalty, mistaking silence for weakness. And when they looked at me, the last free property in Maplewood Estates, they didn't see a neighbor. They saw a threat. The night. It happened. The air smelled faintly of gasoline. I woke to the sound of crackling, at first thinking it was the wind rushing through the pines outside. But when the smoke alarm screamed, I knew. Flames licked the edges of my porch, racing up. The wooden beams with a hunger that only accelerant could give. My house, my sanctuary, my history, was being devoured in an orange inferno. I staggered through the hallways, blinded by smoke, heart hammering in my chest. Heat seared the walls, peeling paint in angry curls. By the time I reached the front door, the porch was already collapsing, forcing me to crash through the side entrance instead. I escaped with little more than the clothes on my back, coughing in the street as neighbors gathered, some in shock, some pretending surprise that I didn't believe for a second. Linda was there, her arms folded, her face illuminated by the firelight. For a fleeting second, I swore I saw satisfaction in her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The smirk she tried to hide told me enough. They thought they had won. They thought the fire would be the end of me, the final push to erase my defiance. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that by lighting that match, they had stepped directly into the web of laws I had written myself, and I had no intention of letting them escape. The morning after the fire, my home was nothing more than a smoldering skeleton. Charred beams jutted upward like broken bones, and ash coated everything in sight. My porch swing was gone, my books turned to dust, my garden blackened into a twisted patch of smoke and soot. Neighbors passed by slowly, whispering, pretending to be sympathetic. Some even offered hollow condolences, their voices dripping with rehearsed pity. But I could see through it all. This wasn't tragedy to them. It was a warning delivered by their enforcers, a reminder of what happens when you defy the HOA. I stood there for hours, breathing in the acrid stench, letting the loss sink into my bones. Everything I had built, every memory soaked into those walls, had been erased in one night. But grief quickly gave way to anger. They thought fire would break me. They thought ash would silence me. But all they had done was ignite something much stronger. The fire marshal arrived mid-morning, clipboard in hand, his face tight with suspicion. He walked the perimeter, muttering observations, crouching to sift through debris. When he finally approached me, his words were careful. "Looks like accelerant," he said. "This wasn't an accident." I nodded. I had smelled the gasoline myself. He couldn't accuse anyone without proof, but the implication was clear. Someone had set this fire deliberately. Someone had wanted me gone. I didn't need to guess who. The HOA board members didn't even hide their smugness. Linda walked by later that afternoon, stopping just long enough to glance at the ruins. "Tragic," she said, her lips twitching at the corners. "Such a shame. Maybe now the neighborhood can move forward." Her voice was laced with venom, as if my house had been nothing but a burden. She didn't linger, didn't offer help, didn't even pretend concern. She knew what had happened. She thought she had won, but I had something she didn't: foresight. Long before the flames, I had prepared for this battle. My evidence binder, packed with letters, photographs, and county documents, had been stored off-site in a small fireproof, safe deposit box. Copies of my deed, notarized and certified, sat neatly inside, immune to the blaze. Every scrap of harassment, every thinly veiled threat, was preserved. They thought the fire destroyed everything. In truth, it destroyed only the surface. The foundation of my case remained untouched. The next step was gathering proof. I returned to the ruins with a camera, photographing the scorch marks, the melted remnants of my porch, the peculiar burn patterns that screamed arson. I noted the faint trail near the side fence where grass had been singed in a narrow line, as if someone had carried fuel. I collected what I could: broken bottles, scorched rags, even footprints pressed into the damp soil that night. It wasn't enough for conviction yet, but it was enough for suspicion. I knew how these things worked. The HOA had money, they had influence. They would try to bury this, to call it an accident, to let the insurance company chalk it up as faulty wiring or unattended equipment. But I wasn't some passive homeowner hoping for justice to magically appear. I was the one who had written the county's fire safety codes. I knew the loopholes, the reporting procedures, the weight of evidence, and most importantly, I knew exactly where to hit them so the law couldn't ignore it. That week, I called, in old favors. Former colleagues, inspectors, even a retired judge who still owed me a drink or two. I laid out the evidence, careful not to exaggerate, presenting it like the attorney I had once been. Quietly, word spread through the legal back channels. The HOA had overstepped. They hadn't just bullied a neighbor this time. They had crossed into criminal territory. Meanwhile, the HOA tried to tighten their grip. They called an emergency board meeting, plastered notices across the community, and spun a narrative about neighborhood safety. They hinted that my house had been a hazard, that perhaps faulty wiring or neglected maintenance had caused the blaze. They painted themselves as concerned protectors, wringing their hands in public while celebrating in private, but their arrogance blinded them. They didn't realize that the very laws they had broken bore my fingerprints. I had drafted the county ordinance that mandated harsher penalties for fires set with accelerants near occupied dwellings. I had written the statute that made conspiracy to damage private property a felony when carried out by a governing body. Every line of their crime echoed back to me, like a trap they had willingly stepped into. In the evenings, I stayed in a small rental cabin on the edge of town, poring over documents, building timelines, mapping every move they had made. Each petty complaint, each anonymous call to the inspector, each threatening letter became part of the larger puzzle, and at the center of it all was Linda, the face of the HOA, the voice that had demanded my compliance. I remembered the look in her eyes the night of the fire. It wasn't shock. It wasn't concern. It was satisfaction. She had thought she was untouchable, shielded by the HOA's money and the silence of her neighbors. But silence doesn't last forever, not when the evidence begins to speak louder. By the end of that week, I had a plan. I would not strike fast. I would strike surgically. Every move had to be deliberate, every accusation supported by irrefutable proof. They had destroyed my home, but in doing so, they had handed me the rope with which to pull them down. The ashes of my house still smoldered when I walked away that night, camera in hand, binder tucked under my arm. They thought they had burned away my strength. But fire doesn't just destroy. Fire hardens. Fire refines. And now I was ready to fight them on the battlefield I knew best, the courtroom. The third week after the fire was when the shift truly began. Up until then, the HOA believed they had silenced me. My house was gone, my presence diminished, and in their minds, I was just another casualty in their campaign for absolute conformity. They didn't realize that every day I spent away from the ashes, I was working to turn the very system they feared most, the law. The first step was the county fire report. It landed on my desk in a thick manila envelope, the kind that carried weight not just in paper, but in consequence. The marshal had been thorough, documenting accelerant traces across the foundation, identifying burn patterns inconsistent with an accident, and noting witness statements about suspicious vehicles. Circling that night. He hadn't named the HOA outright, but the implications dripped from every page. It wasn't faulty wiring, it wasn't negligence, it was arson. Arson carries penalties that no neighborhood association can sweep under a rug. And here was the beauty. The HOA board, in their arrogance, had already begun tying themselves to the crime. In the weeks leading up to the fire, they'd sent increasingly hostile letters demanding my compliance. Several neighbors overheard their grumbling about me being a blight on the community. At least 2 board members had been seen near my property on the night of the blaze. One even let slip at the grocery store that the neighborhood would be better off without that old shack. They thought they were gossiping. What they were really doing was building my case. I started small. I filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office, attaching copies of every letter, every photo, every harassing notice. I didn't march into their office waving accusations. No, I approached as a professional. Calm, deliberate, armed with evidence. When you accuse an entire HOA of arson, you don't lead with fire. You lead with paper. And I had plenty of it. The sheriff didn't dismiss me. He couldn't. Too many documents aligned, too many suspicious patterns emerged. He opened an inquiry, assigning investigators to quietly interview neighbors. Word spread like smoke through Maplewood. Some whispered that I was seeking revenge. Others began to distance themselves from the board, afraid of being implicated. The HOA had relied on unity, but unity falters when fear creeps in. Meanwhile, I began the second phase, pressure. HOAs live and die by their reputation. They depend on compliance, on the illusion of authority. So I began exposing cracks. I wrote careful letters to the local paper, not naming names, but describing the dangers of unchecked associations. I cited anonymous cases of intimidation and hinted at corruption. The editors published them quickly, eager for a story about local power struggles. Soon, residents across the county began murmuring about Maplewood Estates. The HOA's proud reputation turned to suspicion overnight. Linda tried to respond. She sent out glossy newsletters painting herself as a victim of malicious rumors. She claimed my fire was an accident, that the board had offered support, that I was simply bitter. But words don't erase evidence, and every time she spoke, she revealed her desperation. A leader confident in innocence does not scramble to defend themselves. Behind the scenes, I kept building. I requested financial audits of the HOA under state statutes that required transparency. Buried in their records, I found irregularities. Unexplained expenses, checks written to board members, funds diverted into special projects with no paper trail. Corruption layered on top of arson, a legal avalanche waiting to happen. One evening, sitting in the dim light of the cabin I was renting, I laid everything out across the table. The fire marshal's report, the sheriff's inquiry notes, the HOA's financial inconsistencies, the binder of harassment I had kept from the beginning. It looked less like a case file and more like a noose tightening around the board. Still, I knew the fight wasn't just about law. It was about perception. Neighbors who once whispered compliance now approached me quietly, asking what they should do. Some confessed they'd been bullied by the HOA into repainting homes, tearing down playsets, even paying fines that had no legal basis. They were afraid, but anger simmered beneath their fear. All they needed was someone to show them the board wasn't invincible, so I gave them that. I hosted small meetings, not rallies, just quiet gatherings in backyards and coffee shops. I explained their rights, laid out the legal limits of HOA authority, and showed them documents proving the board's corruption. One by one, their fear shifted into resolve. The HOA had thrived on silence. Now silence was breaking. Of course, Linda noticed. She showed up at one of those gatherings uninvited, striding across the lawn like a monarch inspecting rebels. "Be careful who you listen to," she warned, her voice sweetened with poison. "Spreading lies can have consequences." But this time, no one scattered. They stood their ground, their eyes fixed on her, not with fear, but with suspicion. For the first time, she realized she was losing them. The board retaliated predictably. More anonymous complaints filed against me, more smear campaigns in newsletters. They even tried to pressure the sheriff to drop the inquiry, claiming I was harassing them. But each desperate move only tightened the trap. They didn't understand that their every action was being documented, every word cataloged, every step preserved in the growing mountain of evidence. By the end of the month, the sheriff's office had enough to escalate. Official subpoenas were issued. Financial records seized. Board members called in for questioning, and though no charges had been filed yet, the sight of uniformed officers walking into HOA meetings sent ripples of fear through Maplewood. The balance of power had shifted. They had reduced my house to ashes, but I had reduced their empire to doubt. The HOA, once untouchable, now trembled under the weight of scrutiny. As I closed my binder one night, the air still smelled faintly of char when the wind blew from the ruins. I thought back to that first letter, the one that demanded compliance. They had wanted me to kneel. Instead, they had given me every reason to rise. This was no longer about me. This was about every neighbor who had been silenced, every homeowner who had been bullied into submission. My fire was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs, and I was only just getting started. By the 4th month after the fire, Maplewood Estates no longer felt like the perfectly manicured neighborhood the HOA had worked so hard to create. What had once been a place of neatly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes was now fractured by tension. Neighbors whispered at backyard fences. Board meetings that once drew polite applause now erupted in accusations. The HOA was unraveling, and the threads tugging it apart were the very laws they thought would protect them. The sheriff's subpoenas had hit like a storm. Overnight, the board's financial secrets were dragged into daylight. The community newsletter, once filled with cheery recipes and landscaping tips, now contained terse updates from Linda assuring everyone that the inquiry was routine and that the board had nothing to hide. But the residents weren't buying it anymore. They had seen the officers march out with boxes of files. They had seen board members pale as they were called in for questioning. Routine investigations don't involve hand-delivered subpoenas and armed deputies. For me, this was progress. Every week, investigators contacted me for clarifications, each time confirming that my evidence lined up with what they were uncovering. My binder had grown heavier, stuffed with sworn statements from neighbors, copies of the fire marshal's reports, and fresh testimony from those who had finally found the courage to speak out. One such testimony came from a man named Paul, a quiet neighbor who had lived 2 doors down from me for years. At one of our small backyard gatherings, his hands shook as he confessed what he had seen. The night of the fire, he had spotted 2 HOA board members, George and Evelyn, near my property. They carried something between them, a red plastic container that gleamed under the streetlight. At the time, Paul had been too afraid to come forward. But with the sheriff asking questions and the board's power cracking, he finally found his voice. His statement became another nail in the HOA's coffin. Linda, of course, doubled down. She strutted into board meetings with her chin high, insisting the HOA was under attack by a vindictive former lawyer who couldn't accept responsibility for his own misfortune. She painted herself as a martyr, the victim of slander. But her words rang hollow. Attendance at meetings dwindled. Dissent grew, louder. Even her most loyal allies began to question whether the woman leading them had dragged the entire neighborhood into a nightmare. I watched it unfold like a chess game. Every move she made to tighten her grip only loosened it further. When she fined a family for painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue, the family refused to pay, and now, armed with the knowledge I had given them, they knew she had no legal power to enforce it. When she ordered another resident to remove their vegetable garden, the homeowner laughed in her face and quoted state statutes that I had shown them. The illusion of control shattered, and once illusion is gone, authority collapses with it. But it wasn't just the community turning against her. The investigators were circling closer. I knew because they began asking for records from the county property office, permits, signatures, and minutes from the very meetings where the HOA had threatened me. Piece by piece, they were reconstructing the chain of harassment that had led to the fire. It wasn't enough for a criminal trial yet, but the pattern was undeniable. The HOA had targeted me, escalated their pressure, and then, conveniently, my house had burned down. One evening, I attended a board meeting for the first time since the fire. The room was tense, packed with neighbors whose faces carried more suspicion than trust. Linda spotted me immediately, her expression tightening, but she couldn't stop me from sitting quietly in the back. I didn't need to say a word. My presence alone was enough. Every time she mentioned false accusations or community unity, all eyes darted toward me. And when the meeting ended, several neighbors walked past her without a word, choosing instead to nod silently in my direction. The cracks were widening. I continued building the case, not rushing, not pressing too hard. I knew that a premature strike could give them room to recover. Instead, I let the weight of their own arrogance do the crushing. When the sheriff's office asked for clarification on HOA bylaws, I provided annotated copies showing exactly where the board had exceeded its authority. When investigators wanted to understand the financial irregularities, I highlighted the payments that funneled mysteriously into accounts tied to Linda's relatives. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was their guide through the labyrinth the HOA had created. And yet, I wasn't immune to the cost. Every night when I returned to the rental cabin, I felt the hollow ache of what I had lost. My home wasn't just wood and nails. It had been the place where I had built my life, where I had celebrated milestones, where every corner carried a memory. Now it was gone, reduced to blackened earth. Some nights, the grief nearly broke me. But then I would look at the evidence. Spread across my table, the binders stacked neatly, the files marked with names, dates, and signatures. Justice, I reminded myself, doesn't come from mourning. It comes from persistence. Linda must have sensed the walls closing in. She began making mistakes. Her anger seeped into public view. At one meeting, she lashed out at a resident who questioned the board's finances, screaming that people should be grateful for order. At another, she threatened to sue anyone spreading lies, a threat that only deepened suspicion. The composed, confident leader she once pretended to be had cracked into a desperate tyrant. The HOA board fractured under the strain. George, the treasurer, quietly resigned after the subpoenas arrived, citing health reasons. Evelyn stopped attending meetings altogether. One by one, the loyal lieutenants abandoned Linda, leaving her more isolated with every passing week. And through it all, I stayed silent, waiting. Because I knew something she didn't. The district attorney had taken an interest. The sheriff had forwarded the evidence upward. A prosecutor now sifted through the same binders, the same testimonies, the same trail of corruption. And unlike Linda, I knew how prosecutors worked. They didn't move until their case was airtight. But when they did, it was like a gavel striking granite. As I left that fourth board meeting, I caught Linda's eye across the room. For the first time, she didn't glare with confidence. She looked away. That tiny flicker of doubt in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. The HOA wasn't collapsing because I was attacking it. It was collapsing because the truth was finally visible, and truth once seen cannot be unseen. And soon, the law would make sure the collapse was permanent. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside a plain white envelope delivered by a deputy. It wasn't addressed to me, but to Linda and 3 of her board members. I knew what it meant before I even opened the news alerts that followed. The district attorney had filed charges: arson, conspiracy, fraud. The words splashed across the local paper like gasoline on open flame. For months, suspicion had gnawed at Maplewood Estates, but now suspicion had become fact. Linda and her cohorts weren't untouchable leaders anymore. They were defendants, their names listed beside crimes that carried decades in prison. The community reacted in waves. Some residents expressed shock, clutching their pearls and insisting they never could have imagined. Others muttered that they'd always suspected something rotten. But the loudest reaction was silence, the heavy kind that comes when people realize they had enabled tyranny by doing nothing. The HOA that had once marched with smug authority now limped with shame. I watched it all unfold not with glee, but with the steady calm of inevitability. This was never about revenge, it was about accountability. Still, I couldn't deny a flicker of satisfaction as I read the indictment's details. The investigators had uncovered everything. The siphoned funds disguised as beautification projects, the meetings where Linda had pushed for eliminating problem homeowners, the evidence of gasoline containers purchased with HOA debit cards only days before the fire. My binder had been the foundation, but the prosecution had built a fortress upon it. The arraignment was held in the county courthouse, a building I knew intimately from my years as an attorney. I stood among the crowd that day, watching Linda shuffle into the courtroom in handcuffs. She still held her chin high, but the confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle pride that cracked under the flash of cameras. Her co-defendants looked worse, pale, sweating, whispering frantically to their lawyers. For the first time, the HOA was on the other side of the law, and they didn't like the view. Inside the courtroom, the charges were read aloud. Each word echoed like a hammer striking steel: arson, conspiracy, fraud, misuse of funds, harassment. Linda pleaded not guilty, of course. She spoke with rehearsed indignation, painting herself as a victim of a vendetta. But no speech could erase the mountain of evidence stacked against her. The judge set bail high, too high for the HOA's dwindling coffers to cover. Within hours, Linda's assets were frozen, her access to HOA funds severed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, peppering neighbors with questions. Some spoke openly now, describing the fines, the intimidation, the endless demands. Their fear had dissolved the moment they saw the board in shackles. Others avoided cameras altogether, ashamed they had stayed silent so long. Maplewood Estates, once the poster child of suburban order, had become a headline for corruption and crime. For me, the legal battle wasn't over. I knew the defense would fight, clawing at technicalities, trying to poke holes in the narrative. That was their right. But I also knew the weight of evidence was too heavy to escape. Linda had underestimated me from the beginning. She thought I was just a stubborn old man refusing to bow to her rules. She never realized she was waging war against the man who had written the statutes she had trampled on. I didn't stop at criminal court. Civil suits began to form, spearheaded not just by me, but by neighbors emboldened by the board's collapse. Families demanded repayment for unlawful fines. Homeowners sought damages for years of harassment. I filed my own claim, compensation for the house they had burned, for the garden they had destroyed, for the life they had tried to erase. And this time, the HOA's insurance providers weren't rushing to their aid. With charges pending, even corporations abandoned them. The board scrambled to fill the vacuum. A handful of residents tried to keep the association afloat, insisting that Maplewood could recover. But it was too late. The HOA had lost its authority the moment the fire trucks pulled away from my ruins. By the time the indictments landed, it wasn't a matter of repair. It was collapse. As weeks passed, I noticed changes in the neighborhood. Lawns grew a little freer, no longer policed by tape measures and threats. Children's toys appeared, in front yards again. Someone even painted their shutters bright red, a color Linda had once banned. The residents, in shedding the HOA's grip, were rediscovering something they hadn't known they'd lost: freedom. Linda, meanwhile, awaited trial under house arrest. She gave interviews from her porch, still insisting she was innocent, still blaming me. But her words carried no weight anymore. The community she once ruled had turned its back. She was a queen without a kingdom, a leader without followers. I visited the remains of my house often during those weeks. The ashes had cooled, weeds beginning to sprout through the blackened soil. It would take time, money, and patience to rebuild. But I wasn't in a hurry. For now, the ruins stood as a monument, a reminder of what unchecked power could destroy and of how justice could rise from the smoke. The trial date was set for late autumn. The DA's office assured me that with the evidence gathered, conviction was likely. Still, I prepared myself. I knew trials were unpredictable, juries fickle, and defense attorneys skilled at weaving doubt. But doubt could only go so far when gasoline receipts bore your signature and witnesses placed you at the scene of the crime. One evening, as I walked past the neighborhood's community center, I noticed the bulletin board where HOA announcements had once been proudly displayed. It was empty now, the cork bare, the glass smudged with fingerprints. For years, those papers had dictated every aspect of life in Maplewood Estates. Now, there was nothing, and in that nothing, I felt the first stirrings of peace. They had burned my house to erase me. Instead, they had erased themselves, and soon the court would make sure their erasure was permanent. The courthouse smelled of old wood and cold stone, the kind of place where time itself seemed to slow. On the morning of Linda's trial, the benches were packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras poised like vultures waiting for the first stumble. Neighbors filled the rest, some eager, some ashamed, all curious to see how the story would end. For Maplewood Estates, this wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. I took my seat near the front, binder in hand, though the prosecutors had long since built their case without needing my presence. Still, I wanted to see this through. For months, my life had been defined by fire, ruin, and rebuilding. Today was about closure. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise!" The defendants entered, escorted by deputies. Linda wore a navy blazer, her hair pulled back tight, her face carefully painted with the mask of composure. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted around the room, scanning the jurors, the crowd, the reporters. This wasn't the smirk-wearing tyrant who once measured lawns with a ruler. This was a woman staring at the possibility of decades behind bars. The prosecution wasted no time. They opened with photographs of my burned home, projected on a screen larger than life. The charred beams, the blackened earth, the melted remains of what once had been a front porch swing. The images spoke louder than words. Then came the evidence. HOA debit card transactions for gasoline containers, text messages between board members discussing dealing with my refusal to join, minutes from secret meetings where Linda had said, "If he won't comply, we'll make him comply." Each piece stacked higher, a tower of proof too heavy to topple. Witnesses followed. A neighbor testified about seeing Linda's car near my property the night of the fire. Another recalled being pressured to sign false complaints against me. Even a former board treasurer turned against them, admitting she had been coerced into approving shady expenses under threat of fines herself. The defense tried everything. They painted me as a bitter old man with a grudge. They claimed the receipts were misinterpreted, the texts taken out of context. Linda herself took the stand, her voice trembling as she swore she had only ever wanted the best for the community. But her best was smothered under the weight of her worst. The jurors weren't buying it. I sat silently through it all, my hands folded on my binder. There was nothing more I needed to add. The evidence spoke for me. After 2 weeks of testimony, the trial moved to closing arguments. The prosecutor stood tall, his voice steady as he reminded the jury that laws were meant to protect, not to be twisted for power. The HOA was never meant to be a weapon, he said. But in the defendant's hands it became exactly that, and when intimidation failed, they turned to fire. The defense sputtered with last-minute appeals to sympathy, but the jurors' faces were stone. Deliberation took less than a day. When the jury returned, the air in the courtroom thickened. My heart pounded, not with fear but with anticipation. The foreman stood, paper in hand. On the charge of arson, guilty. On The charge of conspiracy, guilty. On the charge of fraud and misuse of funds, guilty. On the charge of harassment and intimidation, guilty. Each word was a nail in the coffin of the HOA's empire. Linda's face drained of color. Her co-defendants slumped in their chairs, the fight gone from them entirely. The judge delivered the sentence weeks later. Linda received 25 years. Her board members received lesser but still crushing terms. Restitution was ordered, not just to me, but to every homeowner they had bled dry with fraudulent fines. The HOA was formally dissolved, its charter revoked, its assets liquidated to pay damages. It was over. The day the verdict was announced, I walked to the edge of my lot, the place where my house had once stood. Construction crews were already laying a new foundation. My garden would grow again, my porch swing would return. But more than that, peace had returned. For the first time in years, Maplewood Estates was free. Neighbors approached me differently now. Some came with apologies, admitting they had been too afraid to stand up before. Others brought casseroles, tools, even offers to help rebuild. I accepted them all with grace, not because I needed the help, but because community was finally being restored, not through fear, but through kindness. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I stood watching the first beams of my new house being set into place. A boy rode by on his bike, waving as he passed. The kind of simple, unpoliced joy the old HOA would have fined his parents for. I smiled. The fire had taken my home, but it had also burned away the rot that had infected Maplewood. In the ashes, something stronger had grown. I knew Linda would spend years replaying her downfall in a prison cell. Maybe she would blame me forever. Maybe she would never see that her own hunger for power had been her undoing. But it didn't matter. Justice had spoken. As the stars appeared that night, I closed the binder one final time. The war was over, and I had won, not by fighting on their terms, but by standing on the law they had thought they could burn.